We have a theist caller that's called in
Mm.
just like within the last minute. And so, hooray. And the atheist callers, hang on a little bit. But Ron in Canada is a theist who has rational arguments for belief in the divinity of the Bible. When you say,
Correct.
Ron, when you say divinity of the Bible, you mean like the actual text, or do you mean that we have good reason to believe in divinity because of the Bible, or that the Bible is divine?
Good question. I would say the belief in the divinity, that there is a God, and that the Bible is a divine text, and
Cool.
that the Bible is an expression of that divinity.
Cool. Make the case. Paul and I are eagerly awaiting.
Good, good. Thank you. Well, I would say that the Hebrew Bible, specifically, I'm defending the divinity of the Hebrew Bible, and that the Hebrew Bible is an expression of of the divine presence of God Himself. Because of the nature of the book, I would say that that is an expression of the divinity.
Okay. So I promise I'm not intentionally trying to be an asshole, but I find this a little funny, so I'm going to be a little bit of an asshole. It sounds to me like
Sure,
what you said is you can tell because of the way it is.
the way it is written and the content that that it writes, that emanates from the book, especially when God speaks, not when humans speak, but when God speaks. To me, it is a clear expression of the divinity.
How do
Well,
you
wait, are
tell the
you?
difference? Go ahead, Paul.
Well, is it so?
Pardon?
You're telling? I thought you were going to be giving some examples here. So you're just saying your intuition
Yeah.
is that
Well, no,
it's
specifically,
divine.
sorry. Yeah, well, specific, many specific examples within the book that for me are an expression that it is divinely inspired. And what I mean is this, for example. So anytime that there is an expression in the book that represents the non-natural nature of God, or anytime that it represents the natural state of man, is an expression of man. And every time that it expresses what man would not do by his very nature, by the fallibilities of his nature, is to me an expression of God.
Oh, wow. This is so basically you're saying when you read the Bible, the things that sound like they're man or from men in origin to you are from men, and the things that don't sound like something a man would come up with are from God.
Correct. Because of course, correct.
Hang
Because
on,
the Bible is, of course,
hang on,
it is written
hang
by
on,
man as well. There are,
hang on,
Moses has his hand.
hang on. So if can you give an example of a specific thing, since you say there's many, where this must come from God? Like what?
Yes. Well, I wouldn't say it must, but it almost definitely would come from a God. I mean, I can't speak in absolutes, but it must come from. It can't come from anything natural.
Well,
And for an
it's funny
example,
that
if
it's
I'll make
funny,
my
it's
first
funny,
example.
it's funny, it's funny that you just after asserting that you say you can't do anything, and you say almost definitely, then you asserted that it can't come from anything natural. Just give me the example. We'll get into whether or not it's non-natural in
Right.
origin and how you
Right.
know.
Right. Well, again, I'm not here to prove the existence of God. I don't think the proof of God can be made. I don't think we
Then
can make
what's the
that.
point? Then
Otherwise,
what's the point? What's the point then? If all you're calling in is to say that you're convinced that you read some things that are from God, but you have no way of demonstrating it, then why should we care?
well, I have a way of demonstrating that it's far more likely to come from a higher authority, or a supernatural, outside of nature authority than from mankind alone.
I'll bet you $5,000 that you don't.
Well, it comes down to
How do you
opinion, of course.
how do you
So, I mean,
demonstrate? So, if we have no demonstration that the supernatural does exist or can exist, how could you ever conclude that something more probably comes from a supernatural source than a natural source?
well, because by the nature of the words chosen and the
No,
nature of what
no,
it
no.
is being
Now we're
expressed.
back to no, Ron. No, now you're back to you can tell by the
Hmm.
way it is. I'm saying to date, there's been no way
Hmm.
that for anyone to tell if something is supernatural in origin. The supernatural has not been confirmed. And as long as that's the case, when you say it's more probable that it's supernatural than natural, what percentage of the natural world do you know and understand in order to be able to rule it out and declare that it's more probably supernatural?
Well, I don't know all of the natural world. That's true. I don't know all of there is to know in the natural world, so I can't say that. But what I do know of the natural world is that some things come from the natural world, can't and typically don't come from the natural world.
Okay,
Mankind is
Example.
not
the
not
state of
not only
nature.
does
The state of
not
nature is
only does that
universal.
not only does
Ma-
that not make sense, not only does that not make sense, but we're still waiting. Give me an example of one thing that is said in the Hebrew Bible that you assert cannot come from a natural source.
okay. Well, many things. But for
I just
example,
want
I
one.
have a
I don't care about any
okay,
bravado or grandstanding. I
okay,
want one.
great.
The one fucking one that I've been
Genesis,
asking for 5
okay.
fucking minutes.
Genesis 1:1.
Bullshit.
What do you mean bullshit?
Goodbye, Ron.
Is that
Goodbye,
your
Ron.
Oh, is that it? That's weak.
Yeah,
That's
that's
weak.
it.
I can explain myself.
You
I
know
can
what's
explain
weak?
myself, but if you want to
You know
hang
what's
up,
weak?
if you want to
You
hang
want to know
up, then
what's
that's the
weak?
easy way out. That's
You
not a
want to know
response.
what's
That's
weak?
an answer.
You want to know what's weak? You want to know what's weak? The phrase in Genesis 1
Well,
1 is, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. This is a
yes.
statement by someone that they are convinced that there is a being that created everything, which, by the way, exists in many different religions. There's what evidence can you provide that it is impossible or incredibly unlikely for any natural source to produce that specific sentence?
Okay. Well, if you let me explain myself before you hang up on me, then
Here you go. I'm going to mute you and you're going to sit there and you're going to listen to me for a minute. Stop whining about us trying to direct the call to a better understanding of what you're claiming. But you're the one that called in to assert that something is more probably supernatural than natural. And when asked for an example, you pointed to Genesis 1 1. It is ridiculous at its face to suggest that this claim that there's a God that made everything couldn't come from a natural source, since literally all of the ones from the other religions that you would reject definitely come from a natural source, unless you think that everybody was deceived by Satan in all of those other religions to ever have the thought. But it's absolutely preposterous and shows that you know nothing at all about human nature to think that humans can't look and say, wow, this person is faster or smarter or quicker than this one, and therefore there might be something that is faster and smarter and quicker than us. I can make something, you can make something better. Hey, maybe where did everything come from? Ooh, I don't know. Maybe somebody made it. Well, no human could make it. Well, it's somebody that's more powerful than that. This natural progression is how we get to Superman. It's how we get to the Beyonder. It's how we get to everything in Marvel. It is preposterous for you to suggest that. But if all you're going to do is suggest that I'm going to hang up on you for being silly and whine about it instead of actually presenting the case, then we're going to get nowhere. So I'm going to take you off mute and we're going to try this again. I'm going to take you off mute. And the question you need to answer is, what evidence can you present, objectively verifiable evidence, that Genesis 1 1 could not be the product of a natural mind?
right. Well, again, it's not could not because that would be 100%. That would be an absolute, and we can't go there. That's proof. I'll say most likely that it does not come. Why? I'll tell you why. Because Genesis 1:1, it starts with the creation of the universe. It's a very non-chauvinistic way to begin a book about a people if the book is supposed to be about a people, which is the way every other book to date has been produced. So because there is a universal message, a very non-human centric and a very non-ethnocentric way of beginning the book, for the whole book of the first of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, it's entirely universal and in no way has anything to do.
I didn't mute you or hang up on you.
Oh, do we
You
lose
you,
you,
you
Ron?
silenced yourself. I
I'm
haven't
back.
hit the mute button.
I'm here.
Everything else.
I'm here.
So,
What point? At what
um,
point did you stop hearing me?
after your
You
completely unfounded assertion that also isn't accurate, because it starts with "in the beginning God," and you're saying that
Yes,
that could not, or almost certainly didn't come from a human mind, because other books you can point to start with a focus on the humans. I'm sorry, but your
that's right.
argument is fallacious and question begging. What is your evidence
Why?
that this is unlikely to have come from a human mind?
Well, I don't know what you mean by evidence. I mean, evidence doesn't have to be absolute. I mean, evidence can be
I didn't
suggesting.
say
I'm
anything about
making an inductive
absolute.
argument. I'm drawing a
I'm
number of
saying, no,
specifics
you're
from the
not. You're
Bible,
making a
from the Hebrew
completely
Bible.
unfounded assertion. And you're just saying that
No, why is it
because,
unfounded?
yes, you are, if you'll shut up and listen, if you assert that X is unlikely to be a certain way because other examples of things similar to X are not that way, that is a fallacious line of reasoning. It is not
Why?
it is
Why is
not an
that fallacious?
argument supported. It is not an argument supported by evidence. It's like saying there are no black swans because every swan I've seen is white. It's literally the black swan fallacy.
Okay.
Also,
Okay. The black.
Ron,
Interesting point, Matt. But of course, what
Ron,
fails
have
about the
you
black
heard?
swan is still a natural explanation of the black swan.
Okay, I'm going to mute you because Paul's trying to ask you a question. And while I think it's nice that you acknowledge that I had an interesting point, you then immediately tried to diverge away from that interesting point by saying that thing is still natural, which is completely irrelevant to the point that you're trying to make. A fallacy is a fallacy not because of its content, not because it's natural. I wasn't saying that this is a natural thing. Paul, please, you had a question.
Well, yeah. So Matt explained why your whole category of argument can't work. I would like to just ask a question: why your specific example is terrible, even if that were a great way to argue. Have you heard of the Enuma Elish?
Pardon?
Have you heard of the Enuma Elish?
No, I haven't.
So
Enuma
the
Elish.
Enuma Elish is the Mesopotamian creation myth. And the Mesopotamian creation myth, the Enuma Elish, is almost unanimously by scholars admitted to be the thing that Genesis 1 is based upon. Now, they don't think, Christian scholars and Jewish scholars don't think that they copied the Enuma Elish in order to, as that was a polytheist thing and they wanted to make it their own monotheism, but they definitely copied it in structure and in words and in verbiage. They absolutely, Genesis 1 was inspired by the literature of the Enuma Elish, such that it needs to be explained by Hebrew scholars. So, the first words of the Enuma Elish are, "It begins." And that's actually what Enuma Elish means. It begins. So, the very verse you picked is almost unanimously by Christian and Hebrew scholars to be a literature copy of another work that predated it and was definitely man-made. So I don't know how you can point to this example as something that couldn't be a sentence that would be constructed by humans, when every scholar that studies this, including people who believe what you believe, say that this was a literary copy.
Can I respond?
Yeah, please.
Well, a literary copy, the fact that it may have been a copy or a mimicking of what came before it, in no way negates its truth. In no way.
No, but I didn't argue that it changed the truth. You said that no human could come up with this sentence. No human could come up with this concept.
Right.
And I just pointed out that
I'm not sure. I
before.
know if you can tell me more about that Mesopotamian myth. Is that the myth of Utnapishtim?
No,
It's the Babylonian creation myth. But here's another thing that you did when
Yeah.
you tried to suggest. Another thing that you did when you tried to suggest that this was unique is you portrayed it as if it is a storybook about us. And in all of these other storybooks that you want to point to about us, they begin with something about us and our ego, and no man could do that. And yet you're categorizing it in a way that's not accurate, because the Bible is a collection of different books. And the purpose of the first chapter of the first book is to present the creation story, not and even if it was only there to present the creation story of man, it begins with, and there's only a handful of verses, it's a single page, you get to man by the end of it, and then all the rest of it becomes about that. But standard storytelling for creation myths is to talk about the creation and origin of everything, which is why the various creation myths have explanations of it's turtles all the way down, or some god did this, or you're the snot flung off of somebody's fingers, or anything else. All of these things are about the creation of everything. And a good chunk of them begin with creation from chaos. The Babylonian myth, Greek myths, Korean creation myths, all Sumerian, all of these things are here. And you're saying that, well, I can't be certain, but it's almost certainly impossible for any human to come up with the sentence, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth," when literally Paul just gave you an example that some people think the Bible was copied from, but in any extent, there are a number of creation myths that begin with "before it began," or "before this began," or "when this began," and it's talking about the universe. The very notion that human beings have not been sitting around thinking about and talking about and creating explanations for the origin of everything and why there's something rather than nothing is preposterous, which is why I scoffed the instant you mentioned Genesis 1:1.
Okay, well, I don't know. I don't know how to make an argument against your scoffing,
I know you
but
don't know how to
my
make an
my
argument.
point my point still stands, because if you look at
No, your point
the
doesn't
the
stand.
Babylonian myth, if I can explain myself for a second, the
No, I'm
Babylonian
done.
myth
I'm
that you
done. I'm
mentioned.
not. This is not the reiteration show. You don't just get to start over to say the same shit
Well,
again.
I'm
Either
responding.
you come.
I'm not.
No,
I'm responding
you're
to the
not.
Babylonian myth
No,
of
you're not. No, you're
that you
not. No,
mentioned.
you're not. No, now are you going to be talking at all? You're not just going to sit here and reiterate the stuff that we've already objected to. Do you have some new evidence to support your case that only a or that a
Well,
natural mind is incredibly unlikely to have come up with that thing? And how unlikely is it?
well, if I can respond the way I would like to respond.
Listen, jackass, you and I have done this tap dance several times here. Every time I finish, you go with, "Well, if I'm allowed to respond the way," no, that you're going to end up just whining like that until I hang up on you, and then you'll think that you won something when you didn't. So here's the way arguments work. You present your case for something, and then the other side presents some sort of rebuttal. And when you're asked for additional evidence, you don't just say, "Well, my point still stands and I'm going to reiterate it," because nobody needs to hear you say that shit again on something that's recorded where they can go rewind. Do you have some other case to make for why Genesis 1:1 is more likely to be a supernatural of supernatural origin than natural origin? And if you do, I'd like to know how you calculated or approximated that probability that supernatural is a more likely explanation for the source of Genesis 1:1 than natural. That's interesting. You're up.
Well, because the whole book continues that way. The whole book continues with the universal message. If you read two more sentences into the Babylonian myth that your friend mentioned, which is a great point, you could see that it fails very quickly in its state of nature, where the gods start fighting amongst themselves and they start having
No, no.
kids.
How do you know that's
They
not
have
true?
they
How do
get
you know that's not true?
because they have offspring. Because gods don't
How do
have
you know that's
offspring.
not true? How do you know that's not true?
I don't. I don't know it's not true, but it's a
Then
very
why are
natural
you
thing
objecting
for
to
a
it?
human.
Then
It's
why are you
it seems like
objecting to
something
it?
that a human would want to create when it talks about the mighty gods vanquishing the weaker gods.
Okay, and it seems like something a human might want to create, that there's a God who knows and loves them and destroys the other gods, just as Yahweh does to the gods of Egypt.
That's a separate point. Maybe that's true too, but
Oh,
I'm
it's a
talking
separate
about
point.
the
It's a
universal
separate point.
creation of the
Okay.
universe. The creation of the
I'm
universe.
well,
There's no more than one God. There's one God.
how do you know that?
God is
How do you know
above
that?
nature,
How do you know that?
based on the text that we're given. According
No,
to
sir. You
the
don't get to
Babylonian myth,
determine.
there are
No,
multiple gods.
sir. No, yes, I know that one of the religions that you're talking about is polytheistic, and then there's the Hebrew notion, which is actually henotheistic, that there are in fact other gods, but just Yahweh is the supreme God. But now you're asserting that there's only one God.
Judaism is not
I'm still
henotheistic.
fucking talking.
Judaism is
What
not
part of I'm
henotheistic.
still
Well, it's
fucking
not
talking
henotheistic
is too difficult for you? Now you're asserting that there's only one God, and I've asked you, and I'm going to ask you again. How do you know there's only one God?
because I'm using the Bible as the
Yeah, you don't
original
get to.
text. This is the
That's
original.
a fallacy.
This is the
That's a
coke. This is
fallacy as well. All right, I'm going to mute you since you don't seem to be able to have a conversation at all. It is fallacious for you to say, "I'm using the Bible." That's the thing you're trying to prove. Your argument, you're making a case that the Bible is divine. You don't get when you say, because it only points to one God. And when I say, how do you know that there's only one God? And you say, because I'm using the Bible. That's called circular reasoning. Do you have a non-fallacious argument, a non-obviously stupidly fallacious argument that is supported by evidence for your conclusion? Yes or no?
If we're going to talk about God, it has to be
That
by
was
the
a yes or no
definition of the first.
question. Okay, I'm going to mute you again. I've asked you a question. I'm going to ask you again because you seem to be incapable of actually paying attention and answering the question that was asked. Do you have a not stupidly fallacious argument supported by evidence that there is only one God? Yes or no?
The only evidence I have is
Yes
the
or
first
no?
book that describes God. The first
No,
book that
that's not.
describes God
Okay,
is
Ron, I'm muting you again. First of all, when I say yes or no, that means the only word that should come out of your fucking mouth first is yes or no. That's how we're going to get the conversation back on track. I'd love to have an open, free-form conversation with you like I could with most other callers, but you seem to have some sort of dirty sock scrubbing around inside of your head that makes it impossible to do that, which is why I've had to put you on mute multiple times in order to get the conversation anywhere near where you're not just fallaciously asserting something. So when I say yes or no, I mean yes or no. But you don't get to then assert that the Bible is the first book about God. And even if it were, that wouldn't prove that it's right about God. I specifically asked if you had a not stupidly fallacious argument supported by evidence, and you immediately ignored the yes or no and then presented another fallacious argument without supporting evidence. So, do you, yes or no, have a not fallacious argument for why there must be one God and only one God?
that wasn't my original argument. My point was the
Okay,
divinity of the Torah, the
goodbye.
divinity of God.
Goodbye.
So
Goodbye,
yeah,
you
exactly,
dishonest fuck.
exactly.
You
Weak,
won't answer
very
yes or
weak,
no.
very weak.
You know
This
what's
is the
weak?
hang up show. This is the
You,
hang up
you,
line.
sir.
The hang up.
No, sir. It's not the hang up line. It's supposed to be where you call in and present arguments for your belief supported by evidence, but you are incapable of actually assessing things fairly and in having a conversation about these things. You keep making fallacious arguments. That's your fault. You're the weak one here. I'm the one identifying fallacies. You're the one spewing them out. You don't get to suggest that I'm the weak one when you're doing that.
Why am I falsely asserting? Why is it false? I'm making a premise. I'm making a syllogism. Why am I
No,
falsely
sir. I don't
asserting
believe that you know
that
what a
the divinity of the
syllogism is,
Torah?
but when you make
Yes,
so if you
yes.
Ron, if you were to say the Torah holds that there is one God, well, that's still dubious because there's many people who would view the Torah's view on gods as if it was henotheistic and not monotheistic, which is one of the reasons that Muslims argue that theirs was the first monotheistic religion. I'm not necessarily convinced that theirs is more accurate than that. But when you present a fallacious argument and we point out the fallacy, that doesn't mean you get to keep going. A fallacy means your argument is rendered useless. It means that we cannot establish whether or not your conclusion is true or not. So, do you have a non fallacious argument to present for your case? Yes or no?
Yes.
What is the non fallacious argument for your case?
Well, I have 120 more examples where the
Ron?
Bible reveals
Ron?
its non-divinity.
Ron, you said you knew what a syllogism
Well, you're
was.
calling it. You're saying
Ron, okay, I'm fucking muting you now. You're never, ever, ever, ever going to be able to talk over me on my fucking show. Ever. I'm going to unmute you. And when I do, you are going to present a syllogism because you claim to know what one is, that is not fallacious, that demonstrates your case. Otherwise, we're going to all point at you, call you weak sauce, and let you go. I'm unmuting you now. Please present your syllogism for your case.
Well, I'm making an inductive argument. I'm making an inductive argument, and my inductive
You're
argument
weak
is
sauce.
strong.
You're weak
So,
sauce. You're weak
yeah.
sauce, weak sauce, weak sauce, weak sauce. You are a pathetic example of a defender of any faith. You don't know what a syllogism is. You cannot have a conversation. You've presented nothing but assertions and fallacies. You are weak sauce. Goodbye. You are the weakest link.
This is entirely unlike me, but that was very weak sauce. Wow. Not good. He agreed that his book was a polemic. It's a polemic against another text, but my text had to be entirely unique. No. I mean, you gave the fallacy why the whole category doesn't work. So it was silly to continue, but yeah.
It's like, how many chances are we going to give Ron When he presents something, we point out why it can't be that way. How do you first of all, I have no way of knowing whether anything is supernatural or not. I have
Nope.
no way of knowing that. Nobody's ever demonstrated any way that we can determine if something's supernatural. And so when someone tells me that they've determined that something is more probable from a supernatural source than a natural source, I already know they don't understand the subject at all. Because probability is either a mathematical calculation, or you can be speaking colloquially and just talking about an
Mm.
approximation that based on these data points and everything else. And so Ron tried to do that by saying, hey, of these other stories about us, none of them begin with a God creating the universe. And then you point out, yeah, actually, they do. I mean, this
hmm
is not every religious book begins with a creation myth, but
Right.
creation myths tend to include all of creation and not just, one little spot or one person. And by the way, given the Hebrew scripture, the creation story is a page and a half and still includes a lot about us, because the point is to say, in the beginning, God created everything. Here's what happened. And then we created humans and they sinned and brought sin and death into the world. And here's the story of what happened after that. It is
And
basic storytelling.
to his weird point, he was saying, well, Genesis starts with all these things. Why would it include that he made light? Well, because the other societies in Mesopotamia worshipped light. So the author of Genesis wanted to say, oh yeah, you worship light? My God made light. Oh, you worship the stars? My God made the stars. Like it is, it is, that's why it was told
Yeah.
that way. And
Your sun
scholars
god
agree.
is weak. Your
Yeah,
sun god is weak sauce because my God created the sun and
yeah,
all of the pinholes in the curtain of night.
exactly. Yes, that doesn't. The burning of the bosom wasn't there for me, Matt.